opportunist, belligerent and unrepentant. Many would say China is synonymous with those words. And true to its nature, Beijing has once again provoked Delhi. China is trying to redraw boundaries and stake claim to areas that are not theirs to stake claim to. Militarily, Arunachal Pradesh has seen its share of transgressions from PLA troops, and politically now, the Xi Jinping administration seems to be asserting its claim unilaterally, at least on certain parts of Arunachal Pradesh, which they see as South Tibet. China has renamed 11 locations in Arunachal Pradesh. It includes 5 mountain peaks, 2 land areas, 2 residential areas, and 2 rivers. What does that mean? That means starting today, names of these locations will be available on Chinese maps in Pinyin, which is the common romanization of Mandarin characters. Now, this is only going to escalate matters between the two nations diplomatically. India and China remain embroiled in a tense border impasse over several friction sites, especially in eastern Ladakh. India and China ties cannot be seen as a one-way street. That was the unequivocal message that was sent by S. Jaishankar in August of last year. But China just doesn't seem to get that message. The message will be sent time and again. It will be sent until China hears it loud and clear, and today was no different. China can needle us all they want, but India will not tolerate it. That was the message the Ministry of External Affairs sent out today through a statement. They said that Beijing has made similar attempts twice in the past and we rejected outrightly. Arunachal is and will be an inalienable part of India, and China cannot claim any of it, is also what the ministry came out and said. China can do anything it wants, but they will not be able to alter reality and the truth. These are invented names, said the Ministry of External Affairs. So the message is quite clear. Now, this is not an isolated incident. Neither is it the first time that China has tried to make these cartographic changes. In the last 6 years, this is the third such attempt by China to reiterate its claim on the entire Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. The first batch of 6 names was released in November of 2017, just a few days after the visit of Tibetan spiritual leader Dalai Lama to Arunachal Pradesh. China was miffed with India for allowing that visit. The second list was then released in 2021 in December, just 2 days before China's new land border law came into effect. There were 15 places that were marked on Chinese maps in a region that was titled South Tibet. In the third attempt, which came in this year, 11 places have now been renamed. Interestingly, the list also includes a town close to the Arunachal Pradesh capital of Itanagar. Now, India has condemned every single provocation from China in the sharpest of words. And it's not just words, there's action too from New Delhi. Whether it's enough or not to deter China, that still remains a subject of debate. But here are the steps taken by the government so far. India is aggressively working on building infrastructure along its northern borders. It has stepped up efforts to counter China's build-up along the line of actual control. The Quad grouping is also aimed to counter China's reach in the Indo-Pacific region. Remember, China was miffed at the fact that the region was called Indo-Pacific to begin with. India has also ramped up lending in Latin America, Africa, and other parts of Asia, including in neighboring countries, to counter China. We've banned more than 250 Chinese apps. They've been termed as a threat to privacy and security of Indians. That digital strike has also happened. But the opposition in this country is not impressed. From demanding answers inside the parliament since the Galwan clash of 2020 to questioning Modi government's foreign policy, the opposition has kept the heat on the issue. Even today, the Congress released a statement blaming the Prime Minister's silence for this aggression that we see from China. They raked up the situation in the Depsang plains of Kashmir to what's happened now in Arunachal. AIMIM chief Assaduddin Owaisi also used this opportunity to slam the central government. Listen in to those reactions.
यहाँ पर मोदी सरकार एनसीईआरटी से मुगलों की तारीख को मिटा रही है, पास को, और चाइना जो है, जिसका मोदी जी G20 इंडोनेशिया में चेयर से, कुर्सी से उठकर, पलटकर, जाकर हाथ मिलाए थे, एनसीईआरटी में मुगलों की तारीख को मिटाया जा रहा है और चीन हमारी प्रेजेंट को मिटा रहा है, प्रेजेंट को मिटा रहा है, हमारे नामों को। ये इसमें खुश है और चीन प्रेजेंट नामों को मिटा रहा है। तीसरी मर्तबा हो चुका है। क्यों हो रहा है? क्योंकि चीन जानता है कि देश के प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी चीन का नाम नहीं लेंगे। दूसरा, ये सरकार फैक्ट्स नहीं बोलती। तीसरा, इनका रिस्पांस वीक है।
मोदी सरकार की एक और कलंक गाथा भारत के सम्मान के लिए लज्जाजनक दिवस है मोदी सरकार पर। एक तरह से उसने भौगोलिक रूप से अपनी धृष्टता चीन ने जाहिर कर दी है। अरुणाचल पर नाम बदलकर कब्जे का उद्घोष किया है। अरे भारत की चिंता करिए प्रधानमंत्री जी, इसकी एकता अखंडता की रक्षा जो हमारे जवान प्राणों की आहूति देके करते हैं, और आप चीन के सामने मुंह खोलने में डरते हैं।
Now, many experts believe that India has been moving away from the policy of coddling China. They are of the opinion that India's support to the One China policy was not an active choice. It was rather a compromise that was executed to maintain a peaceful power balance. But what is this One China policy? Let's break it down for you. This One China policy is a diplomatic acknowledgement, one that acknowledges China's position that there is only one Chinese government and not different Chinese states. It can be traced back to 1949 at the end of the Chinese Civil War. Under this particular policy, nations that have formal diplomatic ties with China cannot have ties with Taiwan, which is seen as a breakaway province. That is China's claim, and that is something that needs to be backed by all nations who have ties with China. That's what the policy dictates. Now, India recognized the People's Republic of China in 1950. India has so far stuck by that policy. But in 2010, we refused to reaffirm it. It was that mention was dropped as far as a joint statement during the Manmohan Singh era was concerned. Back 2 years ago, the Ministry of External Affairs as well once again refused to reiterate that particular claim right after we saw ties souring between the two nations. So does the current policy need a revisit? Is that the only deterrent China will understand? That's our focus on The Right Stand tonight. Is it time for a revisit? Is it time for not just words but action to ensure that China falls in line? Joining me on this broadcast, spokesperson of the BJP, Tom Vadakan. Mohan Kumar Mangalam, spokesperson of the Congress Party, is with us. Professor Brahmachalani, strategic affairs expert, and Aina Tangen, political affairs commentator, also joining us on this broadcast. And before we get into the politics of it, I want to get in Professor Brahmachalani. Do you think that India can do more? Do you think that all that we've done so far as deterring China is concerned is enough, or is there room for more to be done? And if so, then what are those measures that can be taken?
Well, to Prime Minister Modi's credit, India has refused to buckle to the increasing Chinese military pressure. India has more than matched China's Himalayan military deployments. And by locking horns with China in tense military standoffs for the last 34 months, despite the risk of a full-scale war, India has openly challenged Chinese capability and power in a way no other power, including the US, has done in this century. So militarily, India is doing what it should and what is needed. But I think this is where the problem is, that India is not playing its economic and diplomatic cards. To be able to exert pressure on China, to pressure China to behave in a better manner, it's very important for India not just to rely on its military power. It has to also use its economic and diplomatic leverage. For example, letting China increase its trade surplus with India by about 50% last year is out of sync with a situation along the frontier which is almost warlike. The fact that there are tens of thousands of Indian and Chinese troops locked in confrontation. In many places they are in eyeball to eyeball confrontation. In that situation, to allow China to reap rewards of aggression by boosting its bilateral trade surplus year after year to such an extent that has crossed India's total defense spending, that it has actually, China's trade surplus is now more than $100 billion. And diplomatically too, we have, despite all the rhetoric from the Indian side, we have a normal relationship with China. We have hosted the Chinese foreign minister, not just the present one, his predecessor also came despite the standoffs. And this year we'll be having, if Xi Jinping accepts India's invitations, he'll be attending not one summit in India, but 2 summits. In effect, despite the rhetoric, India is doing exactly what China wants, separating the border confrontation from the rest of the relationship. Now, there needs to be a nuanced change to India's China policy, because it's clear that India's China policy is not deterring China.
Sure.
It's not able to stop China from continuing to provoke India. And every week or every 2 weeks brings a fresh Chinese provocation. So we need to rethink our China policy. This does not mean that we need to be more muscular. We need to be wiser. We need to be more forward-looking. We need to see how we can nuance our China policy so as to build greater leverage against Beijing.
Sure. So we need to build that leverage. There are some loopholes that need to be plugged perhaps, but I want to get in Aina Tangen as well. And we've seen the kind of provocations that come to the fore ever so often from the Chinese side. The ties between the two countries are not normal, as the central government has been saying, as S. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, has also been saying. He says it's a two-way street. There has to be reciprocation from the Chinese side and not provocation. Do you think this is only going to put further strain on these ties?
Well, the strain is there, and I think the latest renaming of different characteristics of what China prefers as South Tibet and you refer to as Arunachal Pradesh is really an indication that China is partially giving up. I mean, they see India gathering with AUKUS and with, not AUKUS, Quad.
Yes.
And against China building permanent roads. China is also building things on their side, or what they perceive as their side. So you're seeing a hardening of the lines. There doesn't seem to be any kind of progress being made, although there have been 17 meetings. It's been incremental in terms of the meetings of the different military to militaries to solve this the issue of the extended border standoff. But at this time, I think it would be good. My colleague, says that there needs to be more nuance, more pressure, etc. But I have a couple of questions. All right, if you weren't buying these things from China, where would you buy them from, and would they cost more? And then the second part is, what exactly does India want? Putting pressure on China assumes that China wants something. If that could be enunciated, I think it would be a fresh start. The idea that China is going to hand over disputed areas is probably not very realistic. Idea of trying to start another Ukrainian type conflict situation probably wouldn't work out either, as they're both nuclear powers. So what is it that India wants, and what strategies are they using to get it? That's a question that I often hear here in Beijing, because they're not quite certain.
Sure. So, Tom Borakan, like both our panelists have been pointing out, especially Brahmachalani, who was talking about how, yes, there is a lot that has been done, but there is scope and room for more improvement. There is a long way to go for China actually to fall in line. So, when the opposition says that the government silence or the Prime Minister's silence on this issue is perhaps strengthening China to provoke us ever so often, do you think that criticism is valid then?
Well, Poonam, it is not for the Prime Minister to react on this issue. There is the Foreign Minister, and there's Ministry of External Affairs, and there's a spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs who has rightly reacted to the situation.
Sure.
Be what it may, the whole issue is these are the kind of mind games that China has been indulging over a period of time. They have done changing of names even with Russia. This is not specific on India. They've done that with Russia. They've done that with Taiwan. So this is the kind of game that they play, and mind game. There has been this meeting that was G20 meeting, which the Chinese side skipped because it was held in Arunachal Pradesh on 26th March, and this kind of games go on. But I think the opposition is getting carried away with the fact that we are competent. The borders are well covered. The confrontation is there. There are 2 points at which there's eyeball to eyeball confrontation level, which has been admitted by MEA. Be what the situation may be, but India should not be provoked by all these things. By changing names, you don't come into the territory. This is Chinese maps. They can take it home and set fire to it for all we care. But the point here is we are on a very careful terrain. We want to have diplomatic relation with all our neighbors, and if there is provocation from certain parties in India, it is part of an MOU they have signed. That's the job they are doing.
Sure.
Because every time they get fodder from China, they are at it. So I don't think we should be extremely alarmed on that. Our positions are very clear. Militarily, we are there. Presence is there. We have not given an inch of territory. The territory that has been lost out was during the Congress era. They don't want to admit that. Now, as to the trade relation, there have been apps that have been, banned by India, and there are various other steps India is proactive about China at every international level.
Sure.
So there is a fear in China that India is probably going far
Sure.
ahead and is playing chess according to the games that
Sure,
Chinese
so
would
it's
like
mind
us to
games
play.
and we really must not read much into it. Mohan Kumar Mangalam is also what the DJP is pointing out. Also, I want to ask who really is missing the woods for the trees? Yes, there is a lot that can be done, like several of these panelists have been pointing out, but there's also a lot that has been done. Can we deny the fact that infrastructure has been fortified along the line of actual control? Can we deny the fact that several of these apps have been banned? There has been a digital strike, so to say, against the Chinese. We have strengthened our relationship with other allies of ours to send a message to China. That has been done in the tenure of this particular government. Can you deny those facts either?
Let me start by expanding a little bit on what Mr. Chelani said, because in 2021, our trade deficit with China was close to $70 billion. Our exports to China had actually grown that year. And, after that, we came up with import tariffs, sort of returning to the era of protectionism, if you will. We had the PLI scheme that was launched with much fanfare. But in 2022, which is last year, our trade deficit with China actually went up to $100 billion, over $100 billion. So you can ban as many apps as you want. But I think as time is going by, we're becoming increasingly dependent. Our economy is becoming increasingly dependent on theirs. And I must tell you that our exports to China actually went down last year. So this dependence is only one way, and it seems to be growing. So I think that is something that, as someone from the opposition, I'd be very, very concerned about. Because if it is one way that we can actually manage China is by a healthy economic interdependence, not the one-way dependence that is growing in this particular line. And so you ban TikTok and PUBG, if you will, but nobody's really paying 4G. You put tariffs on activated pharmaceutical ingredients, but I had to climb down really quickly because nobody could make them here. So we need a much more comprehensive economic strategy to be able to ensure that we keep China in check. The other thing I want to say is that one thing that we're not debating, which I think is very, very important to consider, is the Bhutanese Prime Minister's statement that was made 5 days ago. I'm surprised that the Indian Foreign Ministry has the time to respond to these frivolous name changes. This is the third time that it's happening. I think third time's the charm, so they finally ended up responding. Whereas what we should be really responding to, and in an urgent fashion, is the Bhutanese Prime Minister's statement that China actually has a say as to how the border dispute at the Tri-Junction turns out. We all know how strategically important the Doklam Plateau is to us.
Sure, and the Ministry of External Affairs, in fact, did respond to it today, Mohan Kumar Mangalam. There was a press briefing by the Foreign Secretary. He did respond to that particular question. He said there were discussions and that is being discussed as far as the security interests go. But I get where you're going with this. That is something that
this is such a dramatic U-turn for the Bhutanese Prime Minister to say this, and he said this in public. He gave this as a statement to a newspaper.
Sure.
How come we are not choosing to respond to that? We have the Bhutanese king who came. I think he came yesterday or today, and he had a meeting with the Prime Minister and Mr. Ajit Doval. Why is it suddenly that he's come and he's concerned about China's increasing interest in Bhutan?
Sure.
You have China circling us on the Bhutanese side. You have China in Sri Lanka controlling a port. Please let us not pretend that we have all our problems sorted out.
Sure.
And I'm not even going to respond to this nonsensical rhetoric about some party signing an agreement with the CCP. I think the RSS went and signed an agreement with the CCP also. This sort of nonsensical rhetoric is not what we should be engaging in when it comes to an issue of national importance. Very much standing with the government when it comes to facing an opponent like China. But we must understand and discuss how are the different ways that we could actually keep them at bay.
Sure. And Tom Vadakan, there are several ways that can be done. Like we've been speaking on in the last 15 to 17 minutes, as far as the trade surplus is concerned, or that disbalance, so to say, is concerned between exports and imports. Is that something that we could look into? Can we perhaps impose tariffs on at least non-essential items that come in from China? Is that the first step that could be taken? Is that something that is on the minds of those in the power corridors?
Poonam, that's a work in progress. I do not want to talk about it on television right now. From what I understand from my sources, this is a work in progress that is happening. But I would like to tell the Congress representative, there were these lobbying by some of the general secretaries for Chinese companies, and it's been going on. The correct is love and hate policy. I'm not talking about a particular MOU that was signed, but if they're so liberal, why don't they come out with this MOU? I mean, what is so secretive about it? It's not a national secret. Are you scared of something?
Why don't you?
Or is it because
come out
there's something,
with the MOUs
there's a
that you have
giveaway
signed,
which will create problems for the Congress party?
Nonsensical. See, this is nonsense.
It's not nonsense.
I mean,
it's
honestly, when parties go to different parties, hold on a second, let me finish.
By the General Secretary,
Let me
the
finish.
President. What is nonsensical about it? And whenever China
What is nonsensical is that when parties go...
It's understandable. We are working, it's a work in progress. We will do what we have to do. And that is the reality.
You don't have...
We can't talk
You
about
much like...
at this
You,
juncture. We are
you
looking
much
at it.
like
It's work in
the...
progress.
You much like
But
the
when
Chinese
your
Prime Minister...
General Secretary
Hold on a second. Hold on a second.
openly lobby
You are no different.
Chinese
Let me...
companies,
If you're going
what
to
do you
make
have
this...
to say about it? Can you
Let me instead respond to
I can name
you.
the names if you care to hear me out.
Either let him finish or let me talk. One of the two.
I know,
Because
I'm
let
talking.
me say
I'm not,
that
I'm not
you have reduced
intervening.
India.
No,
You have
I am
reduced
talking
India
and
to
I'm
the
not
position
listening.
of the Bhutanese Prime Minister, where everyone
are
knows that
diverting
China
issues.
has been building
You are
villages
diverting
in many
issues.
different points of
It's a
Bhutan,
question that has been
and
answered
he
by
has
NEA.
said that nobody is. No,
And you're bringing up an issue
you're
that
not even hearing the question I'm saying. I'm not actually I'm not actually asking a question here. I'm making a statement, and I'm saying that when the Prime Minister said that nobody has entered our land.
You're raking up an issue which has been
China much
settled.
as the Bhutanese Prime Minister
The matter
today
has
has
been
encouraged
settled.
them.
Will you listen
Every
to
matter
me?
seems
The
to be
matter has
settled.
been
Why are we
settled.
even arguing
Discussions
about
are at a very high level.
It seems to me that
And where are
everything
the
we
steps
should
that
take
we
at
have
face
taken?
value.
I can't talk on the television.
What steps
on a
have you
television
taken?
program, the steps taken
Or are
by
you-
the GOI.
Are you
Because
privy
I'm
to
not-
what the Defense Ministry
I'm not
and
the
the
right
External
to
Affairs
speak
Ministry
as a
is doing as a
political party.
spokesperson?
Sure,
on
these are
an
matters
issue.
of national security and not everything can
Exactly.
be divulged and not everything
So
can
I'm
be
sure
put
that
out.
he cannot.
But
I'm not even sure why he should be aware.
sure, but
It's not something that he should be aware of either. He seems
Yes.
to be saying that he's aware of something that he's not able to divulge. Why exactly is the ruling party spokesperson being aware of national
That is in my
security
personal
measures
capacity. I am
strategies
aware
that
of
we're taking
many
to counter
things
China?
which I will not disclose publicly.
You should not be aware.
I'm not
I
on
think that's
television
actually
to
something
disclose
wrong
these
if
things
you are
to
aware
you.
at all
In my
of these
personal
things.
capacity, I could know a lot of things. And I don't need your permission or the Congress
Sure.
party.
Let's just take for
sure,
granted the
let's leave it at that,
everything he does.
gentlemen. The politics continues, but I want to get in Professor Brahmachalani as well. And the bigger picture here, the bigger point that many experts want to talk about, and that is something that perhaps the decision makers should also be looking at, is this one China policy. We've tried to move away from it from 2010 onwards, perhaps drop that mention, then not really give what China wanted as far as reiteration on that particular policy is concerned 2 years ago. But is it time to do more as far as that policy is concerned? Perhaps try and speak more openly about Taiwan, about Tibet. That perhaps would be step number one as far as that policy goes and sending a message to China goes. Is that something that's doable, Professor Chilani?
It is. Nobody's advocating a wholesale change in India's China policy, but adding nuance to our China policy, seeking to build leverage against Beijing, is something that needs to be done. The fact that Xi Jinping's regime is seeking to open new fronts against India, from Taiwan to the Coco Islands, casts an unflattering light on the Indian government's China policy. China is continuing to build up force levels along the Himalayas, even as military standoffs with India enter the 35th month. The fact that these provocations are happening, and this is just not a mind game, the fact that, for example, if China gains a foothold on the Coco Islands, it will not only open a maritime front against India, but also complete its strategic encirclement of India. So we're looking at developments that have far-reaching effects on India's security. We need to, for example, understand that China's territorial claims to Indian territories are all based on the fact that China claims that Tibet had those links with Indian territories. So Tibet is the basis for China laying claims to Indian territories. And yet, India still recognizes Tibet to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China. Can there be a stance that is more self-injurious to India's interests than this?
Sure.
China is laying claims to Indian territories on the basis of Tibet, and India says that Tibet is a part of China.
Sure.
Now, shouldn't we at least nuance that stance? Shouldn't we begin to
Yes, and
describe
I
the
believe there
frontier?
are many experts who would echo that sentiment. And I'm running short of time, but I want to give 30 seconds to Aina Tangen as well. And Aina Tangen, is it just domestic compulsions for the Xi Jinping administration to indulge in these kind of provocations that they do? Are they just playing to that kind of audience, and there's really not much more to it?
No, it doesn't really get any coverage at the domestic level here. I think it is really just China signaling that it's going to pursue its own policy, regardless of the U.S. and increasingly of India. India has to make a decision whether it wants to be part of this growing multipolar world where you have, the BRICS basically and the developing countries who are pursuing their own interests, or
Yes.
whether it wants to try to straddle between the U.S. and China.
Sure. So whether they're playing to an audience or not, it definitely is a subject of debate here and a subject of politics as well.
Well, they're not playing
I have
to
to,
an audience here.
Yes, I have to
It's
unfortunately
just
leave
not
it at
there.
that. I am running out of time, but I thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us here on this broadcast with your perspective.